connection that ties this shepherd with the Lord God himself. Again, a hint you look at and I look at and we go, Jesus, but they're not saying Jesus at this point. They're going, this is an extraordinary king who is a shepherd and in some way is doing this with quite a connection with God in heaven, in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. He operates in intimate connection with God himself. The result, they'll live securely. He brings security, but his impact is worldwide. It's not just the flock, but the greatness of God is magnified in the geographic dimension. It attains the ends of the earth. Yeah, it's poetry. It's describing as far as you can go, to the limits of exploration, to the limits of what's known about the world. So we found out that this person has some kind of origins in the distant past and will be a shepherd just like the Lord, and he does this in such close connection with the Lord, and then his impact is going to be felt globally. Then the results, first line in 5, and he will be their peace. It very simply concludes that he will constitute our peace. So God's solution is the promise first of a divine leader. Bethlehem's ruler, whose origins are from a town we know and out of the mist of the distant past. The time is not until that mysterious birth and the reunion of God's people. The shepherd who brings security is his identity, and the results are that he is peace. Well, fantastic. But there's more. 5b through 6 portrays our victory under God's leadership. And the symmetry continues. The central section of this section, okay, if you have in very short order in the doom section an A, B, C, B, A, in the resolution section you have bigger segments that go A, B, A. So it's a simple order. Look what it says. But within the B section, there's another symmetry. So that's why this is one of the hardest passages to make out as you go through. Once you see the symmetry, in a way, it's kind of very simple how it's laid out. But it's very hard to pick up on as you're reading. Okay, so it rings this section around with crisis, the impending Assyrian invasion. At the center, though, God's leaders subjugate Assyria, and it has been flanked on each side with those whom God will use. In 5, what is the first line talking about? He will be their peace. It is this singular figure of the leader from Bethlehem, God's divine choice. 7, 8, and 9 are going to bring us back to someone you know and love well, the remnant, in the plural, and particularly how God will use the remnant in bringing salvation in the distant future. So, look what it does. We start with the time. We've got the coming Assyrian invasion. So we start with, he will be their peace when the Assyrian invades our land. So we're going to have the Assyrian invade and marches through our fortresses. Okay, it's the 8th century BC. This is the threat. Assyria is the big world power, the superpower of the world, and they're really mean. Frankly, they're vicious and cruel. And so everybody's scared, silly, of the Assyrians. It envisions Assyria marching through Judah. But God won't let that be the end, because there are deliverers. We will raise against him 7 shepherds, even 8 leaders of men. Oh, who's going to raise these leaders up? The people are. We will raise. These are humans. They're going to be shepherds and leaders. It describes them with 2 words, and it uses a formula, 7, no 8. Very often in the Old Testament, this is poetic, they like to go X plus 1. And that sort of gives you a crescendo, you're building to something. In other words, we have a plurality of leaders who will be part of God's deliverance. In the very middle, they will rule the land of Assyria with the sword. The land of Nimrod, which is the same as the land of Assyria, with drawn sword. Oh, that same threat. The Assyrians, only the Assyrians meet their match. These leaders will gain the upper hand and defeat Assyria. It reiterates here twice the sword. Notice that their efforts are under God, guided by God, led by God. At the same time, they're in the battle, and they have to fight. They've got a sword. There's real danger. It's very down to earth. We pull no punches in the prophets. He will deliver us from the Assyrian. Hold it. Who's he? Well, remember, he will be their peace when the Assyrian invades our land. It goes now to the 3rd masculine personal pronoun, he. We've just had the 7 or 8. That's a plural. Now we get a singular ruler. Well, who's the singular ruler in this context? We met him in 2-5. It's the ruler, the shepherd from Bethlehem. Evidently, he will work alongside the 7 or 8. D&E, when he invades our land and marches into our borders. It picks up the verbs of the beginning of 5, when the Assyrian invades our land and marches through our fortress. Here, when he invades our land and marches into our borders. It changes the object here. Instead of marching through our fortresses, which sounds like a completed conquest, he's marching into our borders. It's the invasion in progress. So it gives you another image of the threat coming. 5, 7 through 9. God's solution, part 2. Human agents. Now it takes up a strand that we just introduced. Plural human leadership, and identifies the remnant as giving rise to the deliverance, because the remnant will be unstoppable. The point seems to be that this remnant God's been talking about in 2 and in 4 won't be able to be derailed, because God is with them. It uses 2 pictures. They'll be like dew or showers. They'll be like a mangling lion. And it ends in total victory, which of course is the undoing of everything they are intimidated by and afraid of in their current situation. So, 7 to 9. We've had the picture, which you've seen already in the outline there, of the Assyrian invasion rings this section at the center, and on either side there are leaders, a singular leader, Bethlehem's ruler, up through 5a, and then in 7 through 9 now, a plurality that will fight back the remnant. The remnant of Jacob will be in the midst of many peoples, like dew from the Lord, like showers on the grass, which do not wait for man or linger for mankind. Picture 1. We've got the remnant like dew and showers. Notice how we set the remnant among the nations, among the peoples. And what's the picture? Dew and showers of rain. Well, what's the issue here? Dew just shows up. Rain just falls. It doesn't wait for us. The clouds full of rain do not come over Champaign-Urbana and pause at the outside of the city until one of us down here says, "Come on ahead, you can rain now." Similarly, in the morning, if you get up early, so I would never be guilty of being in control of this as a night owl, there's nobody who goes out and says, "Okay, how about some dew today?" And then the dew comes. It's not our call. The dew is on the grass, whatever I think about it. The dew doesn't care what I think. Similarly, the rainstorm does not care what I think. It just comes, it does its thing, and then it goes. It comes when God sends it. God's sovereign over the weather. He says, that's what the remnant's going to be like. So remember, too, God says, I'll gather the remnant of people who are left over after disaster. I'll bring you back together. I'll make you whole. I'll make your spatial world whole, too. For I'm going to rule over the remnant. I'll be your new leadership, your new king. Now, you'll be unstoppable. So God is involving and engaging this people who will be his surviving people that he's going to build on in the future. He involves them in what he's going to do to protect his own people. You'll be unstoppable, like the rain. In other words, the rain doesn't pause for anyone. It just comes. The dew just falls. So God's work through his people will be unstoppable. It won't be something that someone will come out and say, hey, no, don't do that. Don't protect God's people. Look at the metaphor in 8. The remnant of Jacob. Oh, hey, here we have the remnant of Jacob again. And in 2 ways it says, they'll be among the nations in the midst of many people. So it sets them in this global international context. Like a lion, here's the picture. Like a lion among the beasts of the forest, like a young lion among flocks of sheep, which mauls and mangles as it goes, and no one can rescue. The second time, we have this picture of the remnant, which evokes both disaster, because you only have a remnant left, and salvation, because you have a remnant left and God's not done with his people. He's going to build again. Then it makes an analogy. Like a lion among the beasts, or a young lion among the flocks of sheep. Well, what do sheep do to fight back if a lion is wandering through? Nothing. I had somebody comment on employment in Illinois that this is an at-will state. It's kind of like lunch at will here. This is an at-will lunch for the lions. They snack at will as they go through a flock of sheep. God's people, who will be just a remnant. That sounds like they're going to be small and weak. God says, I'll use you. I'll make you part of this salvation that's coming, and your progress will be unstoppable. It will be inexorable. There's nothing that can hold you back. You'll be like the lion tramping through the sheep and having lunch at will. Verse 9, your hand will be lifted up in triumph over your enemies, and all your foes will be destroyed. The result is total victory. Put this in 8th century context. What's the result of this picture? It is safety. It is that God's people can live unhindered without somebody trying to kill them, carry them off, completely distract them from worshiping and serving God. And of course, what did God call his people to be? They are to be a conduit of knowledge of the Lord to all the nations around. This missional idea is at the very heart of the Old Testament. And so if now there's security, if there is safety, if they are not tormented by these enemies around, and they take hold of God's calling, they could be that conduit for the knowledge of God. So it's envisioning something for them. It's giving them hope. So in 7 to 9, we've had the unstoppable remnant, like dew and showers, like the mauling lion. The end result is victory. And so you see, we start this chapter with the promise of a singular ruler. We come in 7 to 9 with a large group, the remnant, that God uses, plurality involved, and in the middle you have both a singular and the 7 or 8 leaders, a plurality of leadership. It's all intertwined and woven together. 5, 10 to 15 looks at first like an appendix, but it's not. We already have the promise to the remnant, so you might expect that at this point we'd finish off the section of promise. We even say twice the remnant. But there's a caution that needs to be put in. maybe it's because of the aggressive sounding, powerful nature of these images, there's a caution to remind me that no matter how hard I'm involved in throwing myself into the success, it doesn't come from me. Victory is only from God. So what do we eliminate? We eliminate everything I could trust in instead of God. We eliminate everything I could trust in that is false. And end with a sweeping reminder that the consequences of my disobedience are far-ranging. So, for God's people, okay, victory is certain, but God has got to be the one we trust. For God's people, 10 to 14, he's going to remove every false object of trust. So, how does that look? How do we remove those? Well, there's our might. In that day, declares the Lord, I will destroy your horses from among you and demolish your chariots. I will destroy the cities of your land and tear down all your strongholds. I will destroy your witchcraft, and you will no longer cast spells. I will destroy your carved images and your sacred stones from among you. You will no longer bow down to the work of your hands. Okay, so what do we have? He removes the horses and chariots. What are those?
Warfare.
That's how we make war. This is our ability to make war. These are our tanks. These are our helicopters. He says, by the way, you're going to win big, but it's only going to be by my grace. Because guess what? In that day, I'll destroy your horses. He's addressing his people. He said, I'm going to take away all your tanks, all your munitions. It won't be there. Why? Because you're going to have to trust me instead of trusting in your armaments. I'll destroy the cities, tear down your strongholds. What are those?
Defense.
That's defense. All your ability to defend yourself that you trust in. We have a big wall here. We have a great missile program. God says, that means nothing to me. I'll get rid of that too. I want you to trust me. I'll destroy your witchcraft and you'll no longer cast spells. What's witchcraft and spells here?
False gods.
Well, they're trusting particularly in magic. This is the ancient world, and so there is a strong strand of thought that if you do certain things, carry out a certain ritual, then the spiritual world falls into line with what you want. God says, no, it doesn't. Forget that. I'll just eliminate that so you can't think you can rely on it. Similarly, the carved images, the sacred stones, and bowing to the work of your hands. There, you've got all the false gods, all the substitutes that you worship, all your reliance on things that will never deliver you. 14, I will uproot from among you your Asherah poles and demolish your cities. Well, what's an Asherah pole? What do you do with these when you find them in West Side Park in Champaign?
They use it as a place of worship.
It's a place of worship. It's another idolatrous image. It's a special type in Israel, a fertility image of a goddess that they would often, it seems, they carve out of wood, be on a pole out in a public place. So God says, we'll do away with those, so you can't worship those or think your fertility and your future fruitfulness comes from that, and I'll demolish your cities. That's again a defensive sort of structure that I've got. So this last glimpse, 14, gives you one from the worship column and one from our might. And he says so it's a summation. Kind of says, yeah, everything you would trust in, how strong and powerful you are, and all these other false objects of allegiance. Poof, they're gone. And you can't rely on them anymore. But 15, if this is for God's people here, that he's going to remove all these false objects of trust, now, for the disobedient, 15, I will take vengeance in anger and wrath on the nations that have not obeyed me. Remember the nations from a few verses before? Defines the context. The context defines this here. Who are these? These are people who have shown their open hostility toward God's people. But more important than that, this is not an ethnocentric kind of thing where it's like, they were mean to Jews, so God's going to get them. No. What's God doing through the Jews? God is working towards bringing Messiah. God's bringing salvation. The issue is not they're mean to the Jews. That's an issue. Being inhuman to anybody is an issue because God's not like that. But there's a bigger issue, and that's that these are people who, in a sense, are setting themselves against God's work, against what God has declared he's doing to bring salvation, not just to the Jews, but to the whole world. And they're saying, we hate you, and we want to wipe you out, and God has said, I want to use these people, and it's going to lead to Messiah. And we're going to go global through the Jews. And the Jews may not all have gotten that. Micah got it. Remember, he's got all the nations coming in chapter 4 to worship God and let God be their king and guide and instruct and lead them. But here, these nations have not obeyed me. And it's not a trivial thing. There's the hostility not just to God's people. That's an issue. But there's the hostility. And remember, we're talking in the context where you think of Assyrians, they're hostile to everybody they meet. Anybody they can impale on a pole, they will. And they do that, and they show that in their art, as the way you deal with leaders from places that didn't submit to you right away. They're vicious, they're brutal. But there's more. I think the Assyrians stand for something that is recurrent, recycled. Yes, there is a hostility towards God's people, and there is an inhumanity towards other humans more broadly than any one nation. But beyond that, there is the setting myself against the work of God. That's the unforgivable sin that Jesus talks about in the Gospels. It's not that they were mean to Jesus, it's that they're mean to what God's doing through Jesus at that time. What the Father's got going, he's bringing salvation, and they're trying to fight it. And that's the frightening position to be in, is when I say to God, no, I don't want what you're doing in this world, and I won't work with you. It's what did Pharaoh in with the Exodus. He said, I don't care who Yahweh is. And he says that very, I don't know Yahweh, and I don't care what you guys say. I'm not going to let you go worship him. He sets himself against God's promise that these people should come to the land and God will bring blessing to all the families of the earth through them. God's got a plan for everyone through the descendants of Abraham. Pharaoh says, no! And that does him in. So I take that 15 has some of that flavor in it. I will take vengeance and anger and wrath on the nations that have not obeyed me. In this case, they would be delighted to completely eliminate Israel and Judah. Kill the Jews off, enslave them, assimilate them, so they have no more identity. And in a sense, what they're saying is what God has said he's going to do through these people to reach the whole world. I don't believe, I don't care about, and I will fight against it. So, we conclude. One last thing for you to notice. Remember, we've said remnant each time in the section of hope. There's been a promise about the remnant, or to the remnant, for the remnant. 2:12, I will surely bring together the remnant of Israel. 4:7, I'll make the lame a remnant. Now the remnant of Jacob will be like dew. The remnant of Jacob will be like a lion. So you notice there's a significance in the remnant. Again, every time we get to the hope, it says something about a remnant, which means that beyond the disaster, God's got promise and hope and salvation, and he's not done with his people. No matter how bad the mess I make, I do not derail God's kingdom. He is still working to build that throng of people around his throne in Revelation who are going to come to him and know him and love him and serve him and praise him for eternity. I have the option to be part of building that crowd. If I go against it, I may lose my privilege of participating in that, but there is a remnant that God has at all times. There's always this faithful remnant, and there's the remnant that God uses in his people to build for the future. So you see, as we go through here, the pattern has been very clear that once again you have God doing something. There's a pattern here. If God regathers when all our surroundings fly apart, our leadership is terrible. And this is what I wish for the election of 2016, that I could elect God and get rid of all the Republican and Democrat candidates. I wouldn't be as frustrated. There's no none of the above selection on our ballots these days, unfortunately. God to be the leader. Wow! That's what I'd love. God who leads to victory. Now, the problem depicted in terms of their coming defeat and their inabilities in the wake of their sin and their choices. But God still is giving promise, and he takes that picture and he counterbalances it with him leading them to victory. So one last handout, which you can take and enjoy at home and frame and whatever you do with these. Not throw out, please. These are just two diagrams that show you how the arrangement of the negative section and the positive section look, so that you have a clear picture of that as well. Again, as I said, these are worth framing. Any comments or questions or interaction with this? And forgive me, again, I know our interactive part tonight was the positive, negative spotting of the different parts of the passages. I did feel that it was hard enough to follow this that in a sense we needed to kind of walk through it together. So, although with 2 and 3 there were easy portions to say, let's discuss this as a group and kind of come up with what does it show about, what's it show about the issues in that culture and how does that parallel our culture. It doesn't expose those issues as readily in this section. It simply puts out what's happening, puts out there what's happening, both short-term disaster and long-term salvation. So, forgive me for walking you through it too much, but thank you. You've been very patient. Any comments? Yeah, Lisa.
I think obviously it's really helpful to see the structure of it, but I think, there's also value in thinking. I know we were joking about overthinking it and hedging our bets on that last section and everything, but honestly, I think after walking through it in this depth, I still think that's kind of right. Our discussion about 10 through 14 was like, well, is that positive or is that negative? Like, it's certainly unpleasant, but that doesn't really answer the question.
Yes.
And so it reminds me of a time when my oldest son was about, I think maybe 4 years old, and it had been explained to him upon many occasions that parents discipline you because they love you, right? And if no one cares about you, that's when people let you do whatever you want because that's fine. And I can't even remember what incident had happened, but he suddenly blurted out, "Why do you and Dad love me so much?" And I was so upset, right? And I think this passage kind of reminds me of that, right? Because, like I said to Rick, well, right, there are bad things happening, but, in contrast to all the other doom and gloom sections, which are essentially punitive, right? Mm-hmm. This section right here is not about that.
No.
This section is about essentially discipline that is for your benefit.
Yes.
Right? And I think that's a different, that's a shift in the dynamic that you don't get to unless you're walking through it kind of the way we did and thinking about, so what is really happening here? Is this, what's the intent of this message, right?
Yes, and there's two things that help us with that. One is the overall context lets us put, okay, what is happening here? When you see it in the big picture context, you can say, oh, I think this is what's going on. But the other thing is that there is a negative feel to this, 10 to 14.
Right, it sounds horrible.
But it's a warning. When you see the context, then you realize, okay, this is really a warning. Because what he does is he takes away everything that in that world they
Right.
would have said. We've got big walls.
Right.
We got these idols. We'll pray to them. And God's saying, yep, you won't have any of that.
Right. It was interesting to me in your list, my Sunday school teacher always talks about how basically in any religious system, salvation always comes by one of three ways, and no matter what the system is, it will fall into one of these. It's either magic, merit, or mercy, right? And so it's so clear that, it lays out magic and merit, both out,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And it's, in a way, it's a very comforting passage in the end, but the tone is, at first, it's
Right.
like, oh my golly,
Anything
everything's
that you thought was
taken
going
out.
to do it, not going to do
Kick
it.
all the props out from under you. Trust God. Which isn't a bad place to be left. It's just,
Right.
I thought I had all these
Scary
other things I
getting
could
there.
rely on.
Yeah.
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 All right, great.